The sunlight streamed through the pristine windows of the hillside market, casting a warm glow over its polished floors and neatly stocked shelves. As the automatic doors slid open, Karen Benson strolled in, clutching her designer handbag and wearing her signature look of reserved disdain. Her sharp gaze swept over the rows of organic produce, artisanal cheeses, and imported wines, each item meticulously curated to cater to the high standards of her neighborhood's affluent residents. To Karen, this was more than just a grocery store. It was a place that reaffirmed her lifestyle, a fortress of exclusivity and order that kept out what she often deemed undesirable elements. Karen Benson was a woman of habit. Every Tuesday morning she drove her sleek black SUV to the hillside market to stock up on her essentials for the week. Her life was crafted carefully, and she prided herself on keeping it that way. She had an image to uphold, a reputation to maintain, and a routine that left little room for surprises. She believed that she had earned her place in this world and expected everyone else to respect it, especially in her own store. As Karen made her way down the aisles, she glanced briefly at the other shoppers, her lips pursed in silent judgment. She noticed a young couple fussing over baby food and quickly averted her eyes, rolling them slightly in disapproval. Karen had raised her 2 children alone and never believed in coddling her children, knew the value of hard work and discipline, she thought with pride. Anything less seemed, to her, like an excuse. Her focus was broken when she turned down the bread aisle and saw a figure she didn't recognize. He was a tall black man, mid-20s to early 30s, casually dressed in a blue work shirt and jeans. He was looking over the shelf, as if trying to decide between 2 brands. Her gaze lingered, assessing him with the same subtle scrutiny she reserved for everything that didn't immediately fit her standards. As she pushed her cart slowly past him, she couldn't help but notice how out of place he looked, or so she thought. Karen sniffed lightly, her posture stiffening as she made a deliberate show of adjusting her handbag over her shoulder. She had seen people like him before, young, casual, and in her mind, clearly unfamiliar with her store. Must be a new worker or something, she murmured under her breath, assuming he was an employee who had lost his way into the shopping aisles. After all, Hillside Market was known to hire locals from time to time, though the staff usually stuck to the background, staying out of her way. However, as Karen circled the bakery section, she noticed him again in another aisle, comparing prices on organic coffee brands. A pang of irritation flared up in her chest. This wasn't his store, she thought. Not a place someone like him should casually browse as if he belonged. Karen's irritation simmered, but she held her tongue, reminding herself that she was a classy woman. She had learned long ago not to cause scenes in public, no matter how irritating people were. Instead, she moved through the aisles, determined to avoid him and finish her shopping. But fate had other plans. Near the checkout counter, just as Karen was setting her items down, she felt a presence behind her and turned slightly to see him standing there, holding a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. Her jaw tightened, and she straightened her shoulders, almost as if bracing herself for an intrusion. The man gave a polite nod, clearly acknowledging her, but Karen ignored him, focusing instead on organizing her items. She took her time, intentionally slowing her movements, hoping he would understand that she was in no rush to share her space. Her fingers deliberately rearranged her things, and she took extra care with each item, making sure it was perfectly aligned. After a long pause, she heard him clear his throat softly. "Excuse me, Ma, I am. Are you in line?" Karen stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she turned to him, her voice clipped. "Yes, I am. And I don't appreciate being rushed." The statement came out sharper than she had intended, but she was in no mood to hold back. "You know," she continued, "some of us have schedules, things to do. It's not a race." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "I wasn't trying to rush you," he replied, his voice calm. "I was just asking if you were finished so I knew where to stand." Karen huffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Well, just be patient, all right? There are manners in a place like this. People wait their turn." She turned back to her items, hoping he would simply back off. But as the seconds ticked by, she sensed him still standing there, unmoving. "Of course," he replied, his tone even, showing no sign of hostility. He merely stepped back, allowing her to finish, and Karen felt a small wave of satisfaction. That was until she noticed the store manager, Sarah, a young woman in her 30s, watching the exchange from the end of the aisle with a concerned look. Karen forced a smile, giving Sarah a wave as if nothing had happened, hoping to signal that all was well. Sarah, though, approached them with a cautious smile. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, glancing between Karen and the man. "Everything's fine," Karen said quickly, giving Sarah a pointed look. She didn't need anyone managing her. She had been a loyal customer long enough to know how things should work in this store. But to her annoyance, Sarah turned to the man next, her tone respectful. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Yes, thank you," he replied, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Just waiting to check out." With that confirmation, Sarah nodded and moved along, her concern melting into a polite smile. Karen watched as Sarah's attention shifted back to the register, and once again she felt a surge of irritation. It wasn't enough for Karen to be treated with priority, it seemed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her authority in the store was slipping, being disregarded by the people around her. Finally, her items were rung up, and she stepped aside to let him through. As she loaded her groceries into her cart, she couldn't resist glancing back at him. "You know," she began, her voice just loud enough to be heard, "you could have waited until I was finished before barging up so close." The man looked at her, his brow slightly furrowed. "I didn't realize standing in line was barging," he replied, a hint of sarcasm in his tone. Karen felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't accustomed to people talking back to her, certainly not here, in her own territory. There's a certain etiquette in places like this. People respect each other's space, she said, her tone condescending, as if explaining a concept to a child. He looked at her squarely. "I was respecting your space. You're the one who decided to turn it into an issue." The words stung, and Karen's pride bristled. No one had spoken to her like that in years. She struggled to maintain her composure, her mind racing to find the right response. Before she could think of anything, he gave a small, polite nod and turned back to the cashier, seemingly unbothered. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, a stubborn, boiling indignation. This was her store, her sanctuary. She didn't deserve to be disrespected by anyone here, especially not someone who clearly didn't understand the standards of her world. As she left the store, Karen could feel her irritation intensifying. Every step she took out to the parking lot seemed to amplify the resentment bubbling inside her. She loaded her groceries into her car with sharp, jerky movements, replaying the encounter in her mind. How dare he speak to her that way? How dare he act as if he belonged here just as much as she did? Just as she was about to close the trunk, she noticed him again, walking toward his car, a modest sedan parked a few spots down from hers. She felt a sudden impulse and urge to confront him, to make sure he knew exactly how out of place he was. It was an impulse she couldn't explain, driven by a deep-seated frustration that she wasn't ready to examine. She closed the trunk with a loud slam and walked toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. He noticed her approach, a look of surprise crossing his face as she stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me," she began, her tone icy. "I don't appreciate the way you treated me in there." He sighed, clearly exhausted by the confrontation, but remained calm. I think it's time to let this go." "Let it go," she repeated, her voice rising. "You think you can just walk around acting however you please with no respect for others?" He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of frustration showing in his otherwise calm demeanor. "I didn't disrespect you. I was just trying to check out like everyone else." Karen scoffed. "People like you think you can just come in here and do whatever you want. But this isn't your place." The words hung in the air, raw and accusatory. She watched him, waiting for him to react, to back down, but instead his gaze hardened, his expression turning serious. I suggest you think carefully about what you're saying," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't deserve this treatment. I'm just as entitled to shop here as anyone else." She bristled, her pride pushing her past the point of no return. "People like you don't understand respect," she said, her voice trembling with fury. Without another word, he shook his head and turned to walk away, his footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. For a moment, Karen was left standing there, feeling a strange sense of emptiness settle over her, as he disappeared into his car and drove away. She was left to stew in her own indignation, yet unable to shake the feeling that something deeper, something uncomfortably personal, had been exposed in their brief encounter. Karen's mind simmered as she drove away from the hillside market, gripping the steering wheel with a tension she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't shake the image of that man, his calm expression, his refusal to back down. Her words had cut through the air, accusatory and laced with judgment, yet he hadn't flinched, hadn't shown the slightest hint of intimidation. It infuriated her. He didn't belong in her world, she told herself again, replaying the scene in her mind as if she could rewrite his reactions, make him cower or apologize. A few days passed, but Karen's frustration lingered. Every time she thought of returning to the hillside market, a flicker of irritation reawakened within her. She had been made to feel uncomfortable in her own space, a place that was supposed to serve people like her, people who respected order, who belonged. Yet he had disrupted that balance, undermining the silent rules she believed governed her community. Her sense of indignation had festered into something sharper, a need to reclaim her territory. On Saturday afternoon, as Karen debated where to shop, a familiar flash of anger returned. Maybe it was time to set things right, to go back to the hillside market and ensure her place remained hers. She decided to return to the store, resolute in her purpose, convinced that her presence would restore the sense of order that had been disrupted. As she walked through the doors of the hillside market, Karen immediately felt herself tense, scanning the aisles for any sign of him. To her dismay, it didn't take long to spot him. There he was, near the produce section, casually examining a display of vegetables, as if he had every right to be there. Karen's stomach twisted. It was bad enough that he had shown up once, but here he was again, as though he had decided this was his new shopping destination. She could feel her heart rate quicken, her jaw clench. This was no longer just an irritating encounter, it was a disruption to her peace, a test of her patience. Without thinking, Karen made her way over to him, her footsteps measured yet filled with purpose. Her mind raced with the words she wanted to say, the righteous anger bubbling up with each step. She reached him, her presence casting a shadow across the display, and he looked up, surprised to see her standing there. "You again," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You just can't seem to stay away, can you?" The man straightened, regarding her with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone polite but guarded. "Yes," she replied, folding her arms across her chest. "I'd like to understand why you keep coming here to this store. There are plenty of other places you could shop. Why here?" He looked at her, a flash of bewilderment in his eyes. "I shop here because it's convenient," he said slowly, as though explaining something painfully obvious. "Is that a problem?" Karen scoffed. "Convenient? This isn't your kind of place. People here expect a certain atmosphere, a level of respect." He raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her tone. "I'm sorry if my presence is somehow a problem for you," he said, his voice steady. "But I have every right to shop here, just like anyone else." Her jaw tightened, and she felt her temper flare. "Respect goes both ways, you know. People here don't appreciate disruptions. I don't know where you're from, but here people have standards." The man sighed, visibly weary of the confrontation. I don't know what you're trying to say, but I'm just here to shop. That's all. Whatever problem you have, it's not with me." "Not with you," she retorted, her voice rising. "I'm trying to preserve a certain environment here, a place where people feel comfortable and respected. And if you don't understand that, maybe you should find somewhere else to go." At this, his expression hardened, and he took a step forward, narrowing his gaze. "With all due respect, I think you need to take a hard look at why you feel so threatened. Because I haven't done a single thing to make anyone uncomfortable, except maybe by not bowing down to your ego." The words hit her like a slap, and Karen's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She wasn't used to people speaking to her this way, and certainly not with such defiance. Her mind raced, trying to find something to say, but he had already turned away, his calm composure only amplifying her irritation. As he walked to the checkout counter, Karen's frustration boiled over. She watched him with narrowed eyes, a sense of helplessness filling her as he calmly paid for his items, nodding politely to the cashier. The sight made her seethe. She clenched her fists, feeling a surge of anger, unlike anything she had felt in years. When he left the store, Karen couldn't hold back. She abandoned her cart and stormed out after him, her heels clicking against the pavement with each step. She caught up to him in the parking lot, her voice sharp and unyielding as she called out, "Excuse me." He stopped, turning to face her with a look of disbelief. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with weary exasperation. "Yes, we are," she replied, her tone resolute. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to just waltz into people's lives and disrupt their peace." The man shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face. "I'm not disrupting anything. You're the one following me out here making a scene. All I'm doing is living my life, and if that bothers you, maybe you need to examine why." Karen felt her hands tremble, her voice rising with each word. "People like you think you can just walk around, take up space, act however you want. But not here. Not in my space." He took a slow, deliberate breath, visibly trying to contain his frustration. I've been nothing but respectful, even though you've treated me like I'm some kind of criminal. But I'm done. I don't have to justify myself to you or anyone else." The way he looked at her with that quiet resolve, that refusal to be intimidated, only made her feel more enraged. In a fit of anger, she stepped forward, shoving him slightly. The contact was brief, barely a touch, but it was enough to break the unspoken barrier between them. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He looked down at her, his expression shifting from frustration to something deeper, something that sent a chill down her spine. Slowly, he straightened, meeting her gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. He said softly, "I'm warning you, don't push me. I'm not the one causing a problem here." Karen felt a surge of indignation at his words, a defiant need to assert herself. "Warning me? Who do you think you are? I won't be intimidated by someone like you." In that moment, she lost control. Her hand flew up, striking him across the cheek with a force that surprised even her. The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the parking lot, hanging in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything went silent. He took a step back, a look of shock crossing his face as he brought a hand to his cheek. Slowly, he looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. Karen felt a strange satisfaction, a twisted sense of victory, as though she had finally reclaimed her power. But then, to her shock, he straightened, his expression hardening. Without a word, he raised his hand, returning the slap with equal force. The impact jolted her, sending a wave of pain through her face as she stumbled back, stunned. The two of them stood there, locked in a moment of mutual disbelief, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Karen felt a rush of emotions, anger, fear, humiliation, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. She had never been hit before, never faced this kind of retaliation. Her world felt as though it had been flipped upside down. The man looked at her, his expression one of controlled anger, yet also of deep sadness. "You pushed me," he said, his voice low, "and I pushed back. Maybe that's what you need to understand." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing across the pavement as he made his way to his car. Karen was left standing there, her mind reeling, her body trembling with shock and humiliation. The sting of his slap lingered on her cheek, a painful reminder of the confrontation that had shattered her sense of superiority. Around her, a few people had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. She could feel their eyes on her, their silent questions and unspoken thoughts pressing down on her, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. For the first time, Karen felt the full weight of her actions, the cold realization of what she had done and the consequences it had brought upon her. She looked around, her mind grasping for some semblance of control, some way to regain her dignity. But there was none to be found. As she stood there, surrounded by strangers, the reality of the situation washed over her, filling her with a sense of dread that went far deeper than any physical pain. Her carefully crafted world, her sense of control and superiority, had been shattered, leaving her adrift in a reality she could no longer ignore. Karen turned slowly, the sting on her cheek burning as she walked back to her car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The parking lot around her seemed colder, more unforgiving, and the silence felt suffocating. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with a mixture of anger and shame. She replayed the confrontation over and over, each memory a painful reminder of how far she had fallen, how her own actions had led her to this moment. And as she stared out at the empty parking lot, a single thought echoed through her mind, haunting her with its simple, undeniable truth she had gone too far. By the time Karen Benson woke up the next morning, the video had already gone viral, reaching thousands and soon millions on social media. She had barely taken her first sip of coffee when her phone buzzed with notifications from concerned friends and even distant acquaintances. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was the usual neighborhood chat threads or updates from social circles. But as the buzzing grew incessant, Karen's curiosity got the better of her. She picked up her phone and opened a message from her friend, Linda. Linda. Karen, I think you should see this. Call me ASAP. Attached was a link. Karen's stomach tightened as she clicked it, her heart sinking as she realized it led to a video. The thumbnail alone sent a jolt through her, a clear HD snapshot of her confrontation with Daniel in the parking lot. Her mind raced, trying to recall the details, but the scene played back in perfect clarity as she watched herself on screen, her voice raised and eyes blazing, accusing Daniel of not belonging in her space. She felt her cheeks flush as the clip continued, catching the moment she slapped him. The shocking part wasn't just her actions, it was the way people had reacted, captured in real-time comments scrolling underneath the video. Thousands of comments flooded in, each one hitting her like a slap in the face. This is disgusting. How do people still act like this in 2023? Karen privilege at its finest. This woman thinks she owns the whole world. Glad someone finally stood up to her. A tightness gripped her chest as she read comment after comment, each one a dagger to her pride. Karen clicked away, dropping her phone as if it had burned her. The room spun, and she clutched the counter, desperately trying to ground herself. This was supposed to be private, a small altercation blown out of proportion, nothing more. How had it come to this? Over the next few hours, Karen's world turned upside down. Friends she thought were close stopped returning her calls, and the few who answered only had guarded, clipped responses. Her phone rang repeatedly, not with calls from people she wanted to hear from, but from unfamiliar numbers, journalists and reporters, calling to get her side of the story. Each time she ignored the call, another voicemail popped up, each one seemingly more persistent than the last. Even worse, her children called her in a panic. Her son, Josh, sounded worried and embarrassed, asking her what was going on. He had seen the video at college, where his friends had sent it to him with scathing commentary. Karen tried to explain, her voice faltering, but he didn't want to listen. He cut her off mid-sentence, saying, "Mom, I can't believe this. Do you have any idea what this is doing to us?" before hanging up. As the day dragged on, Karen felt more and more isolated. She tried to console herself, telling herself that people would forget, that the online frenzy would die down. But she underestimated just how much people had rallied against her actions. That afternoon, when she logged into her social media accounts, she found her profiles flooded with messages, many of them harsh, some even threatening. She scrolled through, horrified by the vitriol, each message reminding her of the brutal truth: her actions had consequences, and she was paying for them in real time. Meanwhile, Daniel's world was also shifting. While he hadn't intended for the video to go viral, one of the bystanders had recorded it and posted it without his knowledge. The attention had now turned toward him. At first, he felt uncomfortable with the flood of messages he received, both supportive and condemning, but his friends and family encouraged him to see it as an opportunity. They saw the chance to bring light to the daily injustices people of color still face, a way to transform this painful experience into a moment for broader change. Within a day, the video had caught the attention of several local news stations, who reached out to Daniel, hoping for an interview. Initially, he hesitated, unsure of whether he wanted to relive the ordeal in front of a larger audience. But his sister Maya sat him down, gently reminding him that he could use his voice to make a difference. "Danny, you've always stood up for others," she said, her eyes filled with compassion. "Maybe now is the time to stand up for yourself. This isn't just about you and that woman. It's about every person who's ever been treated like they don't belong." With a deep breath, Daniel agreed to speak to a reporter. The interview was scheduled for the next evening, set to be a sit-down conversation where he would share his perspective. Though nervous, he knew this was a step he had to take, a chance to voice his truth and help others see the reality of prejudice and entitlement. As news of his upcoming interview spread, people began to rally around him. Supporters from his community reached out, offering words of encouragement, sharing his story, and amplifying his voice. By the time the interview aired, Daniel had become a symbol of resilience. a figure representing the courage to stand up to injustice, no matter the setting or stakes. Karen's life, on the other hand, continued to unravel. As the weekend came to a close, she began to feel the sting of professional consequences as well. Her workplace was flooded with emails and messages, with people calling for her to be reprimanded or dismissed. The HR department at her company reached out, asking her to come in for a meeting on Monday morning. She spent the weekend in a haze, torn between anger at the overreaction and a creeping sense of dread over what lay ahead. When she arrived at the office, Karen was met with cold stares from colleagues she once considered friends. The walk to the HR office felt like a gauntlet, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, the HR director, along with her manager, sat her down, their expressions grave. "Karen, I think you know why you're here," her manager began, his voice tinged with disappointment. "We've received numerous complaints about your conduct and the negative attention this has brought on the company. We can't ignore this." She tried to defend herself, explaining that it was a moment of frustration and that she had never meant for things to get so out of hand. But her words fell flat, the weight of the video bearing down on her like a lead weight. "We understand that people make mistakes," Karen, the HR director, said, her tone measured. "But this situation has escalated to a point where we need to take action. Effective immediately, you're placed on leave while we review this incident further." Karen's face went pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges of her chair. She felt humiliated, reduced to a caricature of the person she once prided herself on being. The HR director handed her a notice of suspension, a stack of papers detailing her leave. Karen's vision blurred as she looked at the document, a grim realization settling over her. This wasn't going away. This wasn't something she could control or sweep under the rug. As she left the office, a few of her colleagues averted their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze. Karen felt an ache in her chest, a hollow emptiness that gnawed at her. She had lost more than her reputation. She had lost the illusion of control, the sense of superiority that once defined her. Meanwhile, the community's reaction to Daniel's story continued to grow. Support poured in from unexpected places. Local businesses reached out, offering him free services, meals, and even job opportunities. His inbox was filled with messages from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and gratitude for his courage. Daniel felt a surge of purpose as he read these messages, understanding that his story was no longer just his, it had become a beacon for others who had endured similar struggles. On the evening of his interview, Daniel sat across from the reporter, the camera capturing every detail as he recounted the incident in his own words. He spoke not only of the altercation with Karen, but of the countless moments in his life where he had faced subtle prejudice, the constant microaggressions that added up over time. "I didn't expect this to happen," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't think anyone should have to experience something like that. But if this story can open people's eyes, if it can make even one person think twice about how they treat others, then maybe it's worth it." The reporter nodded, listening intently. "What do you hope people take away from this?" Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to realize that everyone deserves respect, no matter where they come from, no matter what they look like. We're all just trying to live our lives, and we shouldn't have to constantly prove that we belong." The interview aired that night, touching countless viewers who saw Daniel's strength and vulnerability. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the community. Schools and community centers began organizing discussions on respect and inclusion, using Daniel's story as a catalyst for change. As the days went on, Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Her social circles had all but vanished, and even her family struggled to look her in the eye. Her once proud reputation lay in tatters, replaced by a cloud of scandal that hung over her wherever she went. She couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of people's judgment, the silent accusations that seemed to follow her every move. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, she decided to issue a public apology. She recorded a short video, her face pale and eyes downcast, as she tried to explain her side of the story. "I want to apologize to everyone who was hurt by my actions," she began, her voice wavering. "I know that what I did was wrong, and I deeply regret the pain I caused. I let my anger get the best of me, and I am truly sorry." But her apology fell flat. Viewers saw it as insincere, a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation. The comments continued to pour in, condemning her for what they saw as a hollow attempt at redemption. Apologies don't fix racism, one comment read, receiving hundreds of likes in agreement. Maybe think before you act next time. Some people don't have the privilege of a second chance, another chimed in. In the face of such intense backlash, Karen felt herself unraveling. The walls she had built around her world, the layers of privilege and entitlement, had been stripped away, exposing a stark reality she had long avoided. She was forced to confront the painful truth that her actions had consequences, and that she could no longer hide behind her position or status. For Daniel, the experience was transformative. He found strength in the support of his community, in the connections he had forged through sharing his story. He realized that his voice carried power, that he could inspire others to stand up, to demand respect, to refuse to be silenced. Karen, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the fallout of her own choices. A harsh reminder that in today's world, actions have weight, and the consequences of prejudice and entitlement cannot simply be brushed aside. Her journey, though fraught with pain, offered her an opportunity to reflect, to grow, to reckon with the realities she had long ignored. And in the quiet moments that followed, as the world moved on, Karen was left alone with her thoughts, her regrets, and the painful knowledge that she alone had the power to change. The ripple effects of Karen's actions continued to spread like wildfire, reaching into every facet of her life. By midweek, her once orderly, insulated world felt like a distant memory. She was inundated with emails, messages, and voicemails, some expressing disbelief, others outright disgust. The most difficult part was seeing people she had known for years question her character in the cold, detached form of social media comments and messages. Everywhere she turned, there were reminders of the incident, haunting her like an unshakable shadow. Karen's pride stung bitterly as she realized she had become a public spectacle, reduced to a caricature of Karen in every sense of the word. Headlines and comments across the internet, in painfully blunt words, condemned her actions. Karen tried to escape the relentless barrage of judgment by stepping out to run errands, hoping for a reprieve from the digital onslaught. But as she walked into her favorite coffee shop, she felt eyes on her, faces turning and whispering. Some patrons pretended to ignore her, while others stared openly, judgment writ clear across their expressions. The barista, who usually greeted her warmly, only offered a curt nod, barely meeting her gaze as he handed over her coffee. The humiliation cut deep. Her routine, the life she had carefully curated, had been disrupted in the most public way possible. Her neighbors avoided her, former friends barely acknowledged her, and even her children, Josh and Olivia, kept their distance. The shame she felt was suffocating, each interaction a reminder of how far she had fallen. As Karen struggled to cope with the fallout, Daniel's life was also shifting, but in a markedly different direction. In the days following the viral video, he found himself flooded with support. Messages came pouring in from friends, family, and even complete strangers. Many thanked him for standing up to Karen, for refusing to be silenced in the face of blatant prejudice. At first, Daniel felt overwhelmed by the attention. He wasn't accustomed to being in the spotlight and had never intended to become a symbol of resistance. But as he read through the messages, he began to understand the importance of his actions, not just for himself but for others who had experienced similar injustices. Encouraged by his sister Maya and a few close friends, Daniel agreed to speak publicly about the incident. When a local news station reached out, offering him a platform to share his perspective, he hesitated, unsure of what he would say. But Maya gently reminded him, "This is bigger than you, Danny. People need to hear your story. You're giving voice to those who haven't been heard." With Maya's encouragement, Daniel decided to go forward with the interview. The following evening, he sat across from a reporter in a small, dimly lit studio, cameras trained on him as he prepared to share his truth. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as the reporter began with a gentle question. "Daniel, I know this must have been a difficult experience for you," she said, her voice soft yet focused. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze unwavering as he recounted the events of that day, describing the initial encounter with Karen, her confrontational words, and the escalation in the parking lot. He spoke calmly, yet the emotions simmered beneath the surface, giving weight to every word. "I didn't expect any of this," Daniel admitted, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But I want people to understand that what happened to me isn't unique. So many people face this kind of treatment every day. They're made to feel like they don't belong, like they're not welcome. And it needs to stop. The reporter nodded, sensing the gravity of his words. What would you say to others who might find themselves in similar situations? Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. Stand up for yourself. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. We all deserve respect no matter where we come from or what we look like. I didn't ask for this to happen, but if my story can help even one person feel seen, then maybe some good can come of it. The interview aired that night, and Daniel's words resonated deeply. Across the community, people tuned in, many moved by his courage and vulnerability. The story spread, sparking conversations about prejudice, entitlement, and the need for empathy. Schools organized workshops on respect and inclusion, community centers held discussions, and local leaders called for greater awareness. For Daniel, the outpouring of support was both uplifting and humbling. People reached out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of feeling like outsiders in their own communities. As he listened, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that his voice, once silenced, now had the power to inspire others, to create change. While Daniel found strength in his community, Karen continued to spiral into isolation. The apology video she had posted was met with mixed reactions, with many dismissing it as a hollow attempt at damage control. The backlash only intensified, fueling an even greater wave of anger and disappointment. Her workplace became a hostile environment, with colleagues who had once respected her now viewing her with a mix of pity and disdain. She felt like an outsider, a stranger in the very spaces she had once commanded. Meetings felt tense, her input was dismissed, and she sensed the collective judgment of her peers bearing down on her with every interaction. As the week wore on, Karen was called into another meeting with the HR director. The atmosphere was heavy, the room filled with a sense of finality that made her stomach churn. Her manager's expression was stern, his tone devoid of the warmth he once offered. Karen, he began, after careful consideration, we've decided that it's in the best interest of the company to terminate your employment. Karen felt her heart sink, her mind reeling. She tried to protest, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but her words sounded hollow even to her. The HR director handed her a termination letter, her name printed in stark black ink at the top, a reminder of the irreversible consequences of her actions. Leaving the office that day felt like walking through a fog. The people who had once been her friends barely looked at her, their gazes filled with a mixture of discomfort and judgment. Karen's mind raced as she exited the building, clutching the termination letter in her trembling hands. The life she had worked so hard to build was crumbling, piece by piece, and she felt powerless to stop it. As she walked to her car, Karen's phone buzzed with another notification, a message from an unknown number. Curiosity piqued, she opened it, only to find a link to yet another article about the incident. She skimmed the headline, her heart sinking as she realized that the media had begun delving into her past, scrutinizing every aspect of her life. The headline read, Karen Benson, former community leader, exposed a history of entitlement. Beneath it was a photo of her, frozen mid-sentence in the parking lot, her face twisted in anger as she confronted Daniel. It was an unflattering image, one that captured the very worst of her. Karen closed her phone, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She could no longer escape the truth of what she had become in the eyes of the world. She was no longer Karen Benson, the respected member of her community. She was Karen, the woman who thought she could assert her privilege without consequence. In the days that followed, Karen retreated into solitude, her world reduced to the four walls of her home. Her phone buzzed less frequently, the flood of messages dwindling as people moved on, consumed by the next viral story. But the silence offered little comfort. Each empty moment served as a painful reminder of what she had lost: the respect of her community, the friendships she had taken for granted, and perhaps most painfully, the love and trust of her own children. Josh and Olivia barely spoke to her, their once frequent calls reduced to polite, strained conversations. Karen could sense the disappointment in their voices, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. She had tried to explain, to justify her actions, but the words sounded hollow even to her. She had become the embodiment of everything she had once despised, a symbol of prejudice, a cautionary tale. And so she spent her days in isolation, the world outside moving on without her. She was left alone with her thoughts, her regrets, and the painful realization that she alone had created this reality. Her life, once filled with purpose and routine, now felt empty, a hollow shell of the person she had once believed herself to be. For Daniel, life had also taken on a new sense of meaning. The support from his community, the outpouring of empathy, had renewed his sense of purpose. He had found his voice, and with it, a mission to create change. He began working with local organizations, speaking at events, and advocating for greater awareness of the struggles faced by marginalized communities. Through his experiences, he had come to understand the power of resilience, of standing up not only for himself but for those who felt voiceless. His story had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the strength that lies in refusing to be silenced. As he looked back on the events that had led him here, Daniel felt a sense of gratitude. What had once been a moment of pain and frustration had blossomed into something far greater, a chance to inspire, to lead, to make a difference. And in that journey he had found healing, a sense of peace that transcended the anger he had once felt. In the end, Karen's actions had brought about a change she never anticipated, a transformation in herself, in Daniel, and in the community that had witnessed their story unfold. And while Karen was left to grapple with her mistakes, Daniel moved forward, his path illuminated by the strength he had discovered within himself and the support of those who believed in him. As the days turned into weeks, Karen Benson's life became an unrecognizable landscape of shame, regret, and seclusion. The once bustling routine that had given her life purpose had crumbled, and every attempt to rebuild it seemed to only highlight the depths of her fall from grace. It was as though every bridge she had built was now scorched earth. Each morning, she woke to the hollow silence of her home, the absence of purpose pressing down on her like a weight she could not shake. She avoided the outside world, her world reduced to quiet rooms and shuttered windows, each corner reminding her of the life she once commanded with confidence. Her phone, once her lifeline to friends, family, and colleagues, sat dormant on her nightstand, a quiet, damning reminder of the connections she had lost. Her family life had become equally strained. Josh and Olivia, once her closest confidants, had distanced themselves after the video's release. Karen's son, Josh, had avoided her calls initially, a fact she couldn't ignore as he had always been her more compassionate, understanding child. When he finally picked up a few days after her viral apology video, his voice had been tense, filled with a disappointment that hurt more than any angry words could have. "Mom," he had said after a long pause, I just don't get it. How could you act that way? And why did you let it get that far?" Karen had struggled to respond, her throat tightening. She had no good answer. The excuses she'd clung to, that she was defending herself, that she was upholding a standard, sounded hollow even to her now. She could feel Josh's disappointment through the phone, the unspoken frustration and confusion that she had felt at odds to confront. It was just a misunderstanding she'd finally managed, but Josh's silence told her he wasn't buying it. Before he hung up, he offered a quiet, "I just don't know who you are anymore, Mom," and those words lingered long after the call ended. Olivia had been even more distant, her anger apparent in her clipped, short replies. Karen hadn't had the courage to call her directly, instead texting her a few days after the incident. She received a single reply, "I need some space." And Karen knew, from the finality of those words, that her daughter was truly hurt by her actions. The distance from her children, combined with her tarnished reputation, left Karen in a state of isolation that was far more painful than any public criticism. She had prided herself on being a mother who set an example for her children, a woman who, despite her hard edges, could be respected. But now, the shame she felt came not just from the public eye but from within the walls of her own family. As her isolation deepened, Karen became desperate for some kind of human connection, a reprieve from the relentless guilt gnawing at her. She turned to her few remaining friends, hoping they might offer her the empathy and understanding she craved. But even this attempt only served to heighten her sense of alienation. One evening, Karen called Linda, her longtime friend and confidant. Linda had been there through her divorce, through her struggles with her children, through every up and down of her life. If anyone would understand, Karen thought, it would be her. "Linda, I just need someone to talk to," Karen began, her voice wavering. "This whole thing is it's blown out of proportion. People don't understand what really happened." Linda was silent for a moment, and Karen felt a familiar anxiety build in the pit of her stomach. When Linda finally spoke, her tone was uncharacteristically cold. "Karen," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "people saw exactly what happened. The video doesn't lie." The words stung, and Karen felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't as bad as people were making it out to be. But Linda continued, her tone growing softer but no less firm. "You need to take responsibility for what you did," Linda said. "People don't want excuses, they want honesty. And until you're willing to face that, I don't think anyone is going to be able to help you." The call ended soon after, leaving Karen with a sick feeling in her stomach. She had hoped that Linda, at least, would see her side, but instead, her friend's words forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. The support she had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a void she couldn't ignore. She was alone, truly and painfully alone, left only with her thoughts and regrets. While Karen's world seemed to implode, Daniel's life was undergoing a profound transformation. In the weeks following his interview, he had become a beacon of hope and resilience, not just for himself but for his entire community. People who had once remained silent on issues of prejudice now felt empowered to speak out, inspired by Daniel's quiet strength and unwavering resolve. Daniel's days were filled with opportunities to share his story, to speak with people from all walks of life who were eager to listen, learn, and stand in solidarity. Schools invited him to speak to students about respect and empathy, while community centers held workshops inspired by his message. Everywhere he went, people greeted him with warmth and gratitude, their support filling him with a sense of purpose he had never known. Despite the attention, Daniel remained humble, his focus never straying from the message he wanted to share. He saw himself not as a victim but as a survivor, a person who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. His journey, he realized, was not just about standing up for himself but about lifting up those who had long been silenced. The impact of Daniel's story rippled through the community, fostering a sense of unity and hope. People began to speak out against the prejudices they had once ignored, initiating difficult conversations and challenging the status quo. Daniel had become a symbol of change, a reminder that courage and resilience could transform even the most painful experiences into powerful catalysts for growth. One evening, as Daniel was wrapping up a meeting at a local community center, an older woman approached him. She was small and frail, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to shake his hand. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I've lived through so much in my life, seen things I'd rather forget. But you've given me hope that things can change, that people can change." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, he realized that his story had become more than just a moment of personal triumph. It had become a beacon of hope for people who had lived in silence, enduring the pain of prejudice and quiet resilience. For Karen, the isolation only deepened. In her darkest moments, she found herself questioning not only her actions but her very sense of identity. She had always believed herself to be a good person, someone who was fair, and just someone who upheld standards. But the viral video, the public backlash, and the harsh judgment of those around her had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth about herself. She could no longer escape the reality of her actions. The entitlement she had once wielded with confidence now felt like a prison, a cage of her own making that prevented her from moving forward. Every time she tried to rationalize her behavior, she was met with the same sinking feeling, a hollow sense of shame that gnawed at her. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her guilt any longer, Karen decided to take a walk around her neighborhood. She had avoided going out in public since the incident, but the walls of her home felt stifling, suffocating her with memories of a life that was no longer hers. As she walked, she noticed how quiet the streets seemed, as if the very air was thick with judgment. People she passed avoided her gaze, their faces a mix of discomfort and pity. Karen felt as though she were a stranger in her own neighborhood, a ghost haunting the very streets she had once felt so comfortable in. At one point, she noticed a group of young people gathered at a nearby park, talking animatedly about the latest community event. Karen lingered for a moment, listening to their conversation, feeling a pang of longing for the connection she had once taken for granted. She wanted to approach them, to join in, but she knew that her presence would only serve as a reminder of her mistakes. As she continued walking, she came across the hillside market, the place where her downfall had begun. She stopped in front of the store, staring at the doors that had once felt so familiar. The memory of that fateful day flooded her mind, the anger, the entitlement, the words she had spoken without a second thought. For the first time, Karen felt the full weight of her actions, the realization of just how much damage she had caused not only to herself but to the people around her. She thought of Daniel, of the strength and grace he had shown in the face of her cruelty, and a wave of guilt washed over her. She had tried to diminish him, to assert her power over him, but he had emerged stronger, his dignity intact. Standing outside the hillside market, Karen felt a strange sense of clarity. She understood, in that moment, that the life she had built, the privilege she had wielded so carelessly, had blinded her to the truth of who she was. She had defined herself by her status, her entitlement, her need to be seen as superior, but those things had only served to isolate her from the world, to trap her in a cycle of self-righteousness. With a heavy heart, Karen turned away from the store, feeling a mixture of sadness and resolve. She knew that she could never undo the damage she had caused, that she could never erase the pain she had inflicted. But perhaps, she thought, she could find a way to move forward, to rebuild herself from the ashes of her mistakes. As she walked home, Karen made a silent promise to herself. She would confront the person she had become, the entitlement that had once defined her, and she would work to change. It would not be easy, and it would not erase the past, but it was a step toward redemption in a life that had become a shadow of itself. In the weeks that followed, Karen began the difficult journey of self-reflection and growth. She attended community events, not as a participant but as a listener, absorbing the stories and experiences of those she had once dismissed. She reached out to those she had wronged, offering apologies that, though met with skepticism, were given with genuine intent. It was a long, painful process, one that forced her to confront the ugliest parts of herself. But Karen persisted, driven by a newfound humility, a desire to rebuild not only her reputation but her sense of self. For Daniel, life continued to flourish. He remained a pillar of strength in his community, his story a reminder of the resilience that lay within each person. And though he and Karen had taken different paths, their journeys had become intertwined, a testament to the power of change, the strength of the human spirit, and the capacity for growth in even the darkest of times. As Karen moved forward, she held on to the hope that, one day, she could find peace within herself, a peace built not on entitlement or privilege but on the strength of humility, understanding, and compassion. It was a difficult road, but it was a journey worth taking, a journey toward a new beginning, a life defined not by judgment but by the courage to change. The passing weeks became a blur of painful introspection for Karen. The world she once took for granted, the secure feeling of being respected and valued, felt as distant as a dream. She moved through her days as if in a fog, each moment punctuated by memories of who she used to be, juxtaposed with the reality of who she had become in the eyes of her community, and painfully, her family. One morning, Karen received an email notification from the neighborhood association. It was an invitation to a meeting at the community center, a monthly event she had once attended with regularity and enthusiasm. The invitation sat unopened in her inbox for several hours as she stared at it, wondering if she dared to attend. The thought of seeing the faces of people she had once considered her friends and confidants was daunting, and the idea of facing them now, after everything that had happened, filled her with a sense of dread. But beneath her hesitation lay a small, persistent need to try to make things right. Karen knew that hiding away would solve nothing. Her actions had harmed people, and if she was going to begin healing, she would have to face them. So with a shaky resolve, she decided to attend. That evening, Karen arrived at the community center just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the building's facade. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the door handle. Inside, she could already hear the low hum of conversation as people gathered, their voices filling the room with a warmth that felt almost foreign to her now. As Karen stepped into the room, a few heads turned, and the conversations faltered. A wave of whispers rippled through the group, and she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. The once familiar faces now looked at her with guarded expressions, a mix of pity and thinly veiled disdain. Karen took a seat at the back of the room, hoping to remain as inconspicuous as possible. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as the meeting began. The association president, Mr. Collins, stood at the front, discussing community updates and upcoming events. Karen listened in silence, barely absorbing the words, her mind focused entirely on the people around her, on the tension that filled the air whenever someone's gaze flickered her way. Halfway through the meeting, Mr. Collins announced a new community initiative, a series of workshops focused on promoting diversity, empathy, and understanding. He explained that the workshops had been inspired by recent events, mentioning Daniel's story and the powerful impact it had had on the neighborhood. Karen's face flushed as she realized that her actions were the catalyst for these discussions, the reason her community was now focused on addressing issues of prejudice and privilege. The knowledge stung, a painful reminder of the harm she had caused, but it also filled her with a strange sense of hope. Perhaps, she thought, this was a chance to make amends, a way to contribute positively to the changes unfolding around her. When the meeting ended, Karen lingered by her seat, unsure whether to stay or leave. She watched as people gathered in small groups, chatting animatedly, discussing the workshops and the steps the community was taking to foster inclusivity. She wanted to join them, to participate in the conversations, but a part of her feared rejection, feared that her presence would only disrupt the unity they were building. As she turned to leave, a voice called her name. She turned to see Linda approaching, her expression a mixture of compassion and caution. Karen, Linda said quietly, her tone softer than it had been during their last conversation. I'm glad you came tonight. I know it couldn't have been easy. Karen forced a smile, her throat tightening. Thank you, Linda. I wanted to show my support, to try to be part of the change. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. Linda studied her for a moment, her gaze filled with a mixture of understanding and reserve. It's good that you're here, Karen, but understand that making things right won't happen overnight. People are still hurt, and trust isn't easily rebuilt. Karen nodded, the weight of Linda's words settling heavily on her. She knew that forgiveness wouldn't come quickly or easily, that the path to redemption was a long and uncertain one. But she was willing to take that path, no matter how difficult, no matter how many people she had to face along the way. As Karen left the community center that night, a sense of resolve settled over her. She would attend the workshops, participate in the discussions, and do whatever it took to prove that she was capable of change. It was a small step, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in the midst of her self-imposed exile. The next week, Karen arrived early for the first workshop. She chose a seat at the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly as she waited for the others to arrive. She had never attended anything like this before, and the idea of opening herself up to criticism, of confronting the biases and prejudices she had long ignored, filled her with both apprehension and anticipation. As the room filled, Karen noticed Daniel entering, accompanied by his sister Maya. He hadn't noticed her yet, and Karen felt a pang of nervousness at the thought of facing him. She wasn't sure what she would say, or if she even had the right to approach him after everything that had happened. But she knew that if she was going to truly make amends, she would have to face him, to acknowledge the harm she had caused him directly. The workshop began with a discussion on empathy, with the facilitator encouraging participants to share their experiences and listen to each other's stories. As people spoke, Karen felt a growing sense of humility, her own experiences paling in comparison to the struggles others had faced. She listened as people described the pain of being judged, of feeling invisible, of constantly having to prove their worth. Each story felt like a window into a world she had ignored, a reality she had refused to see. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, Karen held her breath, her heart pounding as he shared his story. His words were calm and measured, but the pain beneath them was palpable, a quiet strength that resonated with everyone in the room. I didn't expect any of this to happen, Daniel said, his gaze steady as he spoke. But if my story can help even one person see the world differently, then maybe it was worth it. I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I just want people to understand that respect is a basic right, something everyone deserves. As Daniel finished, a heavy silence filled the room, his words hanging in the air like a solemn reminder. Karen felt her throat tighten, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her as she realized the full extent of the harm she had caused. At the end of the workshop, Karen mustered the courage to approach Daniel. She could feel her hands trembling as she walked over, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and remorse. Daniel, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to say how sorry I am. I know that doesn't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change, to learn from this." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze steady as he studied her. Karen felt a surge of uncertainty, wondering if he would reject her apology, if he would turn away and leave her standing there, exposed and vulnerable. But finally, Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Karen," he said quietly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but I hope you're sincere in wanting to learn. This isn't about me forgiving you, it's about you understanding why what you did was wrong." Karen nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had come here seeking forgiveness, but Daniel's words reminded her that true change was about more than absolution. It was about growth, about confronting the darkness within herself and finding the strength to move forward with humility and grace. As she left the workshop that night, Karen felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet resolve that had eluded her for so long. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and moments of self-doubt. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it, to walk the road of redemption with the knowledge that each step, no matter how small, brought her closer to the person she wanted to become. Over the following months, Karen immersed herself in the community efforts, attending workshops, volunteering at events, and working to rebuild the trust she had lost. Her journey was far from easy. There were days when the weight of her past felt overwhelming, when the judgment of others threatened to pull her back into the isolation she had once known. But with each small act of kindness, each moment of understanding, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of belonging that went deeper than any superficial connection she had once valued. Slowly, Karen began to see herself in a new light, not as a woman defined by privilege or entitlement, but as someone who had the capacity to learn, to grow, and to make a positive impact on the world around her. She knew that her past would always be a part of her, a reminder of the person she had been. But it no longer defined her. It was a chapter she had outgrown, a lesson she had learned through the painful process of self-reflection and growth. For Daniel, too, life continued to evolve. His experiences had given him a platform, a voice that resonated with people far beyond his own community. He became a speaker, an advocate for justice and empathy, his story inspiring countless others to stand up, to speak out, and to work toward a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. Their journeys, though separate, had become intertwined, a testament to the power of change, to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the possibility of redemption even in the face of profound mistakes. And as Karen moved forward, she carried with her the lessons she had learned, the knowledge that true strength lay not in asserting power over others, but in lifting them up, in choosing humility over pride, and in embracing the path of compassion and understanding. As the months passed, Daniel's life had transformed in ways he could scarcely have imagined. What had started as a single, painful confrontation had led to a tidal wave of change, not only for him but for the entire community. Daniel's story, shared widely and passionately, had shifted from being a moment of individual resilience to a collective call for change. And with that change came an unexpected sense of purpose, a path forward that Daniel had not anticipated. By now, Daniel was a well-known figure within his community and beyond. Local organizations and advocacy groups regularly reached out, eager to have him speak at events, to share his experience and perspective on prejudice, resilience, and dignity. The calls came from schools, neighborhood organizations, and even local government offices. People wanted to hear his story, to understand how one person's experience could highlight so many hidden struggles faced by marginalized communities daily. Initially, Daniel felt hesitant about stepping into this new role. He had never thought of himself as an activist or a public speaker. Growing up, he'd been quiet, soft-spoken, a man who preferred to stay in the background. But his sister Maya encouraged him to embrace the platform he now had, reminding him of the power of his voice. "Danny, this isn't just about what happened to you," Maya had said one evening as they sat together, sorting through invitations and requests that had piled up. "People are listening to you. They want to hear what you have to say because it resonates with them. You're not just speaking for yourself, you're speaking for everyone who's ever felt invisible, everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Daniel had nodded, absorbing her words. He knew she was right. His story had become something larger than himself, a beacon for others who had faced similar struggles but had been too afraid to speak out. And with that realization came a sense of responsibility, a duty to continue speaking up not just for himself but for all those who couldn't. Daniel began to make public appearances, speaking at schools and community centers, sharing his story with audiences who listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of empathy, anger, and determination. Each time he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room, a palpable energy that underscored the importance of his message. People hung on his words, their eyes focused on him as he recounted the events that had unfolded in that parking lot, the moment that had changed his life. At one event, Daniel spoke to a group of high school students, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to his own. He could see himself in their faces, young people struggling to find their place in a world that often seemed stacked against them. As he shared his story, he saw a spark in their eyes, a spark of recognition, of understanding, of hope. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," Daniel said, his voice resonating through the room. "To feel like you don't belong, like you're always on the outside looking in. But you don't have to stay silent. You don't have to accept that feeling. You have a voice, and your voice matters. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." The students clapped, some even standing to cheer him on, and Daniel felt a surge of pride and purpose. This was why he was here, to inspire others to find their strength, to remind them that they too deserved respect and dignity. Outside of the public eye, Daniel continued his work within his community. He joined a local organization focused on social justice, becoming an advocate for change within his neighborhood. He spent time organizing events, collaborating with community leaders, and working to bring about tangible improvements for those who had been overlooked or underserved. One of the first projects he became involved in was a mentorship program for young men of color. Daniel, along with several other community members, volunteered to mentor high school students, helping them navigate the challenges of adolescence and preparing them for the future. Each week, Daniel met with a group of young men, sharing stories, offering guidance, and listening to their struggles and aspirations. Through these mentorship sessions, Daniel found a deep sense of fulfillment. He watched as the young men he mentored grew in confidence, their sense of self-worth blossoming as they realized they had a support system behind them. They looked up to him, seeing in him a role model, a source of inspiration, someone who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. And Daniel, in turn, saw in them the promise of a brighter future, a generation empowered to stand up for themselves and their communities. One evening, after a particularly meaningful session, one of the young men, Malik, stayed behind to speak with Daniel privately. Malik was usually quiet, reserved, a young man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. But tonight his eyes shone with determination. "Mr. Daniel," Malik began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you. Before I met you, I didn't think my voice mattered. I didn't think anyone would care about what I had to say. But you showed me that I do matter, that my voice is important." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, a deep sense of pride swelling within him. "Malik, you don't need anyone to tell you that you matter," he replied, his voice gentle. "You have so much strength, so much potential. Never let anyone make you feel small. You're capable of great things, and I can't wait to see what you'll accomplish." Malik smiled, his expression filled with a newfound confidence. As he left, Daniel felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a reassurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. His life, once shaped by a single painful incident, had blossomed into something beautiful, something filled with purpose and meaning. Meanwhile, Karen continued her journey of introspection and growth, though it was often fraught with setbacks and moments of doubt. Attending community workshops and engaging in volunteer work had been humbling, forcing her to confront the deep-seated biases she had long ignored. Each session was a painful reminder of her past mistakes, but it was also an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become a better person. Karen knew that regaining the trust of her community would not be easy. People were still wary of her, their interactions with her tinged with skepticism. She understood that her apology, though sincere, was only the beginning. Words alone would not be enough to heal the wounds she had inflicted. She would have to prove, through her actions, that she was committed to change. One of the most challenging aspects of her journey was rebuilding her relationship with her children. Josh and Olivia had been deeply hurt by her actions, their faith in her shaken by the person she had revealed herself to be. Karen had tried reaching out to them, expressing her regret and her commitment to change, but their responses were guarded, their trust in her fragile. In an effort to show her sincerity, Karen invited them to one of the community workshops she was attending. She knew it would be difficult, that they might not be ready to forgive her, but she wanted them to see the steps she was taking, to witness firsthand her dedication to growth and understanding. To her surprise, both Josh and Olivia agreed to attend. The workshop was focused on empathy and understanding, with participants sharing personal stories of hardship and resilience. Karen listened as people spoke, her heart aching as she absorbed their words, each story a reminder of the harm caused by prejudice and entitlement. At one point, the facilitator asked Karen if she would like to share her own experience. She hesitated, her throat tightening as she felt the weight of her children's gaze on her. But she knew that if she was going to make amends, she would have to be honest, to confront her past openly and without excuses. I made a terrible mistake, Karen began, her voice trembling. I thought I was entitled, that my perspective was the only one that mattered. But I was wrong. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. And I'm truly sorry. I'm here because I want to change, to be better, to learn from those I once dismissed. I know it will take time, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back the trust I lost. As she spoke, she felt the weight of her children's presence beside her, a silent but powerful reminder of what she stood to lose. When she finished, she looked at them, her eyes filled with remorse and a longing for forgiveness. Josh and Olivia said nothing, their faces unreadable, but Karen sensed a shift, a softening, a glimmer of understanding that gave her hope. Daniel's journey, too, was evolving, as his role within the community grew. He had become a trusted voice, a leader whose actions spoke as powerfully as his words. Through his work, he had built a network of supporters, people who shared his vision for a community built on empathy, respect, and understanding. One day, as he was finishing a meeting with a local advocacy group, he received an unexpected message. It was from Karen requesting a meeting to discuss her journey, her efforts to change, and her desire to understand more deeply the impact of her actions. Daniel was taken aback, uncertain of what to make of the request. Part of him wanted to turn her down, to leave the past behind and focus on the future. But another part of him recognized the courage it took for her to reach out, to seek understanding. After a moment of reflection, Daniel agreed to meet with her. They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of the community. As they sat across from each other, an awkward silence hung between them, the weight of their shared history filling the space. Karen was the first to speak, her voice tentative. Daniel, I know that an apology isn't enough, but I wanted to thank you for being willing to meet with me. I've been doing a lot of soul searching, and I realized that I needed to really understand the harm I caused. I hope that one day you can see that I'm trying to be a better person. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Karen, change is a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. I don't expect perfection, but I do hope you'll keep learning, keep growing. It's the only way forward. They talked for hours, sharing stories, perspectives, and hopes for the future. By the end of their conversation, a fragile understanding had begun to form, a sense of mutual respect rooted in their shared experiences and their commitment to growth. As they parted ways, both Karen and Daniel felt a sense of closure, a peace that had long eluded them. Their paths had diverged, but their journeys had intersected in ways that had transformed them both. And as they moved forward, each carrying the lessons they had learned, they knew that the road ahead, though difficult, was filled with the promise of change and the hope of a brighter, more compassionate future. Months passed, and both Karen and Daniel found themselves on paths they could not have imagined just a year prior. Life had become a tapestry of small, daily changes, of incremental growth and painful realizations. They each had carved new lives from the wreckage of a single moment, lives marked by awareness, purpose, and resilience. For Karen, the journey toward change remained challenging, yet strangely liberating. She had reshaped her world around the humbling work of self-reflection and service. Volunteering became a routine, and community projects filled her schedule. She was a regular at the weekly community workshops, not out of obligation but from a genuine desire to understand herself and others more deeply. As Karen became more involved in community work, she discovered that her life was slowly being rebuilt, not around her former social circles or her once high status, but around people who, like her, were striving to create a more inclusive and compassionate world. She spent her weekends with local groups, organizing events aimed at bridging cultural gaps, fostering empathy, and encouraging discussions around respect and equity. One Saturday, as Karen was packing up supplies after a neighborhood cleanup project, a woman named Margie approached her. Margie had been a familiar face in the community, someone Karen had always seen at a distance but had never really known. "You've been coming to these events for a while now," Margie said, her voice kind but filled with curiosity. "Why are you doing all this?" Karen looked down, considering the question carefully. She could have brushed it off with a quick answer, but she chose honesty. "I made some big mistakes," Karen replied, her voice steady but filled with a raw vulnerability. "I hurt people, and I thought I could justify my actions. But I was wrong. I'm here because I'm trying to make things right. I don't know if I'll ever fully atone for what I did, but I'm here because I want to try." Margie studied her for a moment, her face softening. "Sometimes trying is all we can do. But from what I've seen, you're putting in the effort, and that matters." Karen felt a sense of relief, a quiet affirmation that she was on the right path, no matter how difficult it might be. She knew she would likely always carry the weight of her past mistakes, but each small step, each moment of growth, reminded her that she could choose who she wanted to be moving forward. For Daniel, life had also changed in profound ways. He had become a fixture in his community, not just as a leader but as a symbol of resilience and strength. His work with the youth mentorship program grew into something larger, a project that expanded beyond his immediate neighborhood, reaching schools and organizations across the city. One day, while visiting a high school to speak about empathy and social justice, Daniel encountered a young student who reminded him of his younger self. The student, a boy named Marcus, had been struggling with self-worth, his confidence often undermined by the biases he faced in school and his community. After the talk, Marcus approached Daniel, his expression a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "Mr. Walker, I wanted to say thank you. Hearing you talk about standing up for yourself, it made me realize I don't have to just accept the way people treat me. I deserve respect too, right?" Daniel felt a surge of pride and empathy. "Absolutely, Marcus. You deserve respect, and you deserve to be seen for who you are. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." They spoke for a while longer, and as Marcus left, Daniel felt a profound sense of purpose. It was moments like these, he realized, that gave his journey meaning. He had turned his own experiences into a force for good, transforming his pain into a pathway for others to find strength. Though Karen and Daniel's lives had taken different turns, their paths crossed from time to time, usually at community events or during workshops. Each encounter was marked by a respectful distance, a mutual understanding that had replaced the animosity of their past. They had not become friends, but there was a silent acknowledgement between them, a recognition of shared growth, of the journeys they had each undertaken toward becoming better versions of themselves. One afternoon, during a panel on social responsibility hosted at the local library, Karen and Daniel found themselves sitting next to each other as speakers shared their insights on community building. Karen listened intently, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and humility as each speaker emphasized the importance of empathy, of breaking down barriers between people from different walks of life. As the panel concluded, the facilitator invited questions from the audience, encouraging participants to share their thoughts and reflections. Karen's hand rose almost instinctively, and when the facilitator called on her, she stood, her voice wavering slightly as she began to speak. "I just want to say thank you to everyone here," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room, landing briefly on Daniel. "I know firsthand how much this work matters, how much it can change lives. I spent so much of my life thinking I had all the answers, that my way of seeing things was the only way. But I've learned that true growth comes from listening, from understanding, from looking beyond yourself." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here today because people were willing to show me grace, to give me a chance to learn and grow. I just hope I can continue to be deserving of that grace and to give back to others." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Daniel watched her, a sense of quiet respect forming in his heart. He knew how difficult it was to speak with that level of vulnerability, to stand before others and acknowledge one's flaws. It was a reminder of how far they had both come, of the power of change. When the event ended, Daniel approached Karen as she gathered her belongings. She looked up, surprised, a hint of uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "You've come a long way, Karen," he said, his tone warm but sincere. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I can see the difference. I think a lot of people do." Karen felt a swell of gratitude, a sense of validation that she hadn't realized she'd been craving. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know. I wouldn't have gotten here without people like you willing to stand up, to remind me that I needed to change." They shared a quiet moment, a brief but meaningful exchange that underscored the transformation each had undergone. It was a full-circle moment, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption. As time went on, both Karen and Daniel continued their separate paths, each of them embodying the lessons they had learned. Karen became an advocate within her community, dedicating herself to fostering understanding and inclusivity. She joined the board of a local organization focused on social justice, using her position to promote initiatives that supported underrepresented communities. Her life, once marked by entitlement and privilege, was now defined by humility and service. Daniel, meanwhile, expanded his work into a citywide initiative, partnering with other advocates and leaders to bring mentorship and resources to communities in need. His reputation as a speaker and activist grew, and he was invited to share his insights at events across the state. His story had become an inspiration to many, a reminder that adversity could be a catalyst for positive change. One evening, as Daniel was preparing for a speaking engagement, he received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and careful, with his name written across the front. Inside was a single page filled with words that, as he read, stirred a profound sense of closure. "Dear Daniel, I wanted to reach out and thank you again, not just for your grace, but for your resilience. Because of you, I've become a better person, someone who understands the value of empathy and the importance of standing up for what's right. I know that words alone can never undo the hurt I caused, but I hope my actions in the future will speak louder than any apology I could offer. You've shown me that true strength lies not in holding power over others, but in lifting them up. I am grateful for that lesson, and I will carry it with me always. With gratitude, Karen." Daniel folded the letter carefully, a sense of peace settling over him. He had learned through his journey that forgiveness wasn't always about absolution, but about understanding, growth, and the willingness to move forward with compassion. The letter was a reminder of how far they had both come, of the shared journey they had undertaken in their search for healing and purpose. That night, as he spoke to an audience of hundreds, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose, a deep connection to the people listening. He spoke not just about his own story, but about the potential for change that lay within each of them. The road to growth was difficult, filled with obstacles and moments of doubt, but it was a road worth traveling. In the end, Karen and Daniel's lives remained intertwined, their journeys a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Through adversity, they had each found a path forward, a path marked not by bitterness but by hope, by the courage to face oneself and to embrace change. And as they moved forward, they carried with them the lessons they had learned, each step a reminder that redemption was possible, that the future held the promise of a world where empathy and understanding could triumph over prejudice and pain.